Welcome back to the Explore African series. Are you guys okay?
Yes.
Today we're going to be looking at the topic African Proverbs. Does anybody know what Proverbs mean? Okay, we're going to go through that. So the objective is to explore the importance of Proverbs, their origins, applications, historical evidence, and how it has shaped the African continent's lifestyle, religion, and culture. So, African proverbs have rich and diverse history. These proverbs are generational in nature because they're often passed down from one generation to another, and they encapsulate the wisdom, cultural values, and oral traditions of African societies. So while it's challenging to provide an exhaustive history, we can explore the general characteristics and the significance of African proverbs. So Proverbs, essentially, it's a way, just like we went through the parables of Jesus, it's a way of communicating knowledge, right? Or communicating a certain principle, communicating a certain value to people. Now, going through some general history of parables, we see parables from the context of origins and cultural significance. Oral tradition is one of them. So African proverbs are deeply rooted in the continent's oral tradition. And your mom has gone through one of the African series where she talked about how history in Africa is passed down from one generation to the other. And you have one of the ways they do that is through spoken words, which they called Owe, whereby people will use spoken words. They will gather children around in the evening every day, and they will tell them stories about their great-grandfather. They will tell them stories about their families, about their culture. And that's the only way people were able to pass down information from one generation to the other. Nothing was written down, okay, because they couldn't write. But the only way they had to pass information down to the next generation is through spoken word. Okay, so these oral traditions are passed down from ancestors to descendants, and they serve as a means of preserving cultural wisdom and knowledge. Then we have the diversity across regions. So Africa's immense cultural diversity is reflected in its parables. Different regions, ethnic groups, and tribes have unique proverbs that reflect their distinct histories, languages, and way of life. Then under the themes and subjects, we have connection to nature. So many African proverbs draw inspiration from the natural world, using metaphors from animals, plants, and landscapes to convey deeper meanings about life, relationships, and human behavior. Then we look at the community and unity. So under this, Proverbs often emphasize communal values, highlighting the importance of unity, cooperation, and mutual support within families and communities. So under ethical and moral guidance, African proverbs serve as ethical guidelines, providing moral lessons and insights into virtuous behavior. They address issues of honesty, integrity, and social responsibilities. So under transmission and adaptation of the proverbs, African proverbs, the first and foremost way of oral transmission is due to historical circumstances and a strong oral tradition. African proverbs have primarily been transmitted verbally from one generation to another, fostering a sense of continuity and shared heritage. But the downside to oral transmission is the fact that people can forget details if what they've learned is not written down. And this is why writing things down is very, very important. The downside to oral tradition is you lose details and you lose some information over time. Because if I tell you a story now and I'm not there and you tell somebody else that story, are you going to say it exactly how I said it to you? No, you won't. It's not possible. You will miss some tiny details.
So that means that the next person after the next person will be forgetting them.
A little bit. But if you write the story down in a book, if I tell you that story and I miss something else, all you have to do is go get the book where the original story was told. Go get the book and read it for yourself, and you fill in all the gaps that I've missed out when I was telling you. Okay, so that's the power of writing things down. Other form of transmission is adaptation to changing times. So while deeply rooted in tradition, African proverbs are not static. They adapt to changing social, political, and economic landscapes, allowing them to remain relevant in contemporary context. So the timeline that we have, there are 4 distinct timelines that we have for African proverbs. So constructing a precise timeline for history of African proverbs is challenging due to the oral nature of the transmission and the diversity of African cultures. Proverbs have been an integral part of African societies for centuries, passed down through generations and evolving with time. Instead of chronological timeline, here are key points that highlight the historical development and significance of African history. So it's not an exact timeline in the sense that we can't be rigid about this, okay? But this gives us an overview of how the African proverbs has evolved over time. So we have the pre-colonial era, which is the time before the Europeans went to Africa. And during this time, we have 2 distinct times under this era. The origins in oral tradition, which is the ancient times, we talked about that already, and the cultural diversity, which ran across various centuries. So African proverbs have ancient origins deeply embedded in the oral traditions of various ethnic groups across the continent. They served as a means of passing down wisdom, cultural values, and moral guidance. The different regions and ethnic groups developed their own set of proverbs, reflecting the diverse landscape, languages, and cultural practices of Africa. So essentially what that means is the kind of proverbs that you get from Nigeria, Yoruba people, or the Igbo people in Nigeria, or Hausa people in Nigeria, even can be different, distinctively different from each other, right? Because people can only come about proverbs based on what they have seen in the environment, okay? If I've not been to America before, and I've not seen what America looks like, for instance, can I make up a proverbs to start talking about America? It will be difficult, right? Because I've not seen the people, I've not seen the place, what it looks like. So I cannot just be making up, proverbs that will reflect the American culture. So that's why it's important that's why the cultural landscape and the environment, it's a huge factor in the way proverbs were created in those days. So then we have the colonial and post-colonial era. So this is after the Europeans invaded Africa, and immediately after they invaded, and after some of them start to leave. The impact of colonization of Africa by Europeans' power had a profound impact on traditional cultures, including the transmission of proverbs. Some proverbs adapted to reflect the challenges and changes brought about by colonial rule. So again, we're talking about how the environment and what's going on around that time can affect how proverbs were created and made up. Okay? So, and we have the cultural resilience of some of these, proverbs. Despite the challenges of colonization, African proverbs remained resilient, continue to be an important aspect of cultural expression. They played a role in maintaining cultural identity and resisting cultural erosion. Okay, and this is very important as well. Even though the Europeans tried as much as possible to change the identity of a lot of African nations and to impose their own identity, their own values on those African countries, some African countries actually resisted and they preserved their own culture that you would never know that they were even ever colonized. Then we have the contemporary era, and one of them is the integration of these proverbs into literature and media. And African proverbs gained recognition beyond oral tradition, finding their way into literature, media, and artistic expressions. So we see this in music, in arts and culture. Writers and artists began incorporating proverbs into their works, providing a broader audience with insight into African wisdom. So this is the era where a lot of documentation, is going on. And the second part of this is the global recognition. With increased globalization and cultural exchange, certain African proverbs have gained global recognition. They are appreciated for their universal wisdom. The importance of cultural diversity is recognized on an international scale. And again, you see this in a lot of Europeans' universities where they're actually teaching African studies. So this is like, a lot of research is going into even trying to understand, some of the things that have been lost in history. And now there's an active effort in preserving, those information, and essentially that will ensure that the African culture, African history is also preserved. And the last era is the ongoing evolution, and we have here the adaptation to modern context. So African proverbs continue to adapt to contemporary context, addressing issues relevant to modern world. They play a role in discussion on ethics, leadership, and society challenges. Now, in the digital age has provided new platforms for the sharing and preservation of African proverbs. Online platforms, social media, and educational resources contribute to the dissemination of these cultural treasures. So, quiz time. So, question 1. Only a fool tests the depth of a river with both feet. A. You don't jump straight into a situation without thinking about it first. B. You need to be a good swimmer before jumping into a river. So question number 2. If you offend, ask for a pardon. If offended, forgive. So A. Try and explain why you have offended someone else but when offended, make sure they explain why too. B, if you upset someone, apologize to him or her. If someone upsets you, forgive him or her. Question number 3. The best way to eat an elephant in your path is to cut him up into pieces. A, it will be difficult to eat an elephant all by yourself. If you share with others, you can eat it quicker. Or B, the best approach to solving a problem is to take it bit by bit, one at a time. Question number 4. A roaring lion kills no one. A, you cannot achieve or gain anything by mere sitting around and just talking about it. Or B, you still have to be careful about roaring lions because you don't know when they are hungry. All right, question number 5. If a child washes his hands, he could eat with kings. What does this mean? Does it mean A, it makes sense to wash your hands before eating? Or B, if you prepare and allow yourself to be well trained, when you have the opportunity, you will achieve a lot and be favored in due course. African proverbs are very much linked with our rich history. In order for Africa to preserve this history, we need to continue to embed it in our way of life. And we shouldn't be afraid to share it with the world in this digital age. And look at the last Proverbs there. Self-consciousness.
Do not look where you fell, but where you slipped.
So what do you think that means? It means that don't look at your mistakes. Look at what caused your mistakes. Otherwise, you may repeat the same mistake again. So don't look where you fell. Look where you slipped. Always, try and find answers to the causes rather than the effect of the cause.